If you look at the launch industry in 2015, right before the first reusable rocket launched, the number of rockets was equivalent to the number of daily flights out of Napa, California. Today, the number of rocket launches per year is equal to the number of flights out of LAX. That means the aerospace industry went from Napa to LA in the last 10 years. That's bananas. The reason I'm so excited right now, especially about Varda, is because we now are driving global launch demand to go from Napa Valley to LAX to something even crazier, because that is really the unlock that makes rockets look like airplanes from a cadence perspective. And then once they are taken off as much as airplanes, then shipping to space is truly shipping. And when that happens, then the free hand of the market really lifts us off the planet.
Thanks for joining us. Well, I'm really glad we get to have this conversation. I'm in front of this very interesting, eclectic crowd. And as Brandon was saying, the goal is to try to bring together all these different communities. And I'm remembering being in this room, being at TED last year. TED is going on right now. And I had to give a talk. And it was branded, Kmele Foster explains the meaning of life. That was not my choice. And I don't actually know. But I know that the talk began with me talking about cave paintings. And, you know, we've all seen these images of the cave paintings. You've got a handprint on the wall, and there's like wildebeest being hunted. But there's also cave porn, but that's a whole different event. But there's also a bunch of constellations. And at a minimum, just kind of stars, but you can kind of see the Pleiades and a bunch of other stuff. And you'll see this over and over again. And for me, it's just, there's this sense that we've always been looking up. And we've certainly gone through different chapters of kind of the human space exploration project. And we're at a very different chapter right now. And you all at Varda Space Industries are doing a lot of cool stuff. But to begin, I'd love for you to give us just kind of the elevator pitch that you have to give, because you guys have raised a bunch of money. But I also want you to just paint a picture for us. Like 20 years from now, Varda's hit their marks. You've just dominated the roadmap. What does the world look like when Varda is a household name? How have things changed?
Yeah, it's very much the continuation of what you just described. As far as looking up at the night sky, it looks different for every time you learn something. It means something different to the now more educated of what it actually is looking up. And in a way, Varda is just like that. So the end goal of Varda's home run story, and 10 years from now, is the fact that there will be humans with drugs in their body that only exist because we were able to develop them in microgravity. Without microgravity, some formulations just can't be developed on Earth that are prohibited because of gravity. So we'll get into the physics of that, which is pretty interesting. But it's not even just Varda. This is a pretty well-known aspect. So we want to be first, but it's happening. The unit economics just work out. And so you'll have patients in a hospital or in a clinic who are taking a drug that's this formula of the drug. And by formulation, I mean, is it a shot or an IV bag or a pill or an inhalable? This formulation of the drug was enabled by microgravity. It's just something that is unobtainable on Earth. The weightlessness that you feel in outer space also affects the chemical reactions. And so by having those unique chemical reactions and the access to it in microgravity just means that there'll be new drugs that exist on Earth that wouldn't otherwise. And quite frankly, I think it'll be boring for patients. There's going to be some snotty-nosed kid who's getting, a microgravity drug, and he'll take it as much as an advantage as we take a refrigerator, in the sense that a refrigerator allows new formulations. And it took a long time to invent the refrigerator, and we take it for granted now, and they'll take it for granted then.
When you sit next to someone on a flight and they ask you what you do, like, how do you generally explain it?
I say I'm an engineer. And that's it. Too many questions after that.
But there's always a follow-up, I imagine.
Right.
Occasionally there's a follow-up.
Yeah, I'll be like at the barber shop, and they'll be like, oh, what do you do? And I'll be like, engineer. They're like, oh, where? And they'll be like, Varda. And they'll be like, oh, what do they do there? And I'm like, uh-oh, satellites. And they'll be, oh, what kind of satellites? And then at that point, it's like, it's over. It's like, oh, God damn it, drugs. And then it's like, oh, everyone in the barber stops and looks over, right? Yeah. And you're like, wait, let me get this straight, right? So I usually can go like 3 questions deep before the conversation just completely derails.
Yeah. Well, I'd love for you to just kind of talk about the founding of Varda, the sort of team that you've built there, and why a company like Varda would be headquartered in LA, and in particular in El Segundo.
Yeah, so credit to my co-founder who's not here, so I'll take all the credit. But he came up with the idea, and he called me up, and his firm, Founders Fund, invested into SpaceX back in the day. And so once reusable rockets became regular, he knew, and the rest of the firm knew, that new businesses like Varda were now possible. So he went and looked to invest in our now competitors because he knew that manufacturing in space was a thing that was now enabled by these reusable rockets. But he didn't like anything that he saw. So he said, okay, instead of investing into a company, maybe I'll just go find a co-founder and just do this the right way. And so he was looking for someone with my profile who had worked at SpaceX, who had started companies before, and who was ready to drop everything and go on a crazy adventure. So I checked those 3 boxes. And then as far as, why drugs, it's just from first principles, microgravity gives you the unique ability to manipulate the outcome of chemical systems, unlike otherwise impossible on Earth, and the most expensive chemicals per unit mass, per unit pound, with a large market are drugs. So it's a killer app for microgravity. So he said, hey, do you want to come do this? And I said, absolutely. So I dropped everything, quit my job on Wall Street, called up a few people in the audience here and said, hey, do you want to also quit your job and build this? And the unit economics work out. It's kind of just a math problem at the end of the day.
And could you talk a little bit about the trajectory of like human space travel? Like we began with these Apollo missions, at least putting people on the moon, but certainly there was a bunch of stuff before that. But then there was this period of time where some of the enthusiasm just kind of faded away a bit. We did get the ISS up into space. We continued to do some rocket launches, and we just stopped doing that for a while.
Yeah, that's right.
And then what happened?
It comes down to reusable rockets. And so for those that aren't as involved in the aerospace industry, if you imagine taking an aircraft flight across the country, and then you can only use that 737 once, and it's just for one flight, that would make tickets extremely expensive. But now and so that's the way rockets were throughout the Apollo era and throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, into the early 2000s. And there was this huge golden era, if you will, of aerospace in the 60s. And that was really a proxy war between us and the communists, or the Soviets, I should say. And so we couldn't go to war. So we needed some other, measuring contest. And so the moon was it. All right.
Yeah.
And then once we won that proxy war, the funding kind of dissipated because there was no business value to really drive further growth in space other than defense, telecom, and Earth observation are kind of the 3 industries where you can make money in outer space, until reusable rockets and the idea for reusable rockets. And really that's kind of powered by computers at the end of the day that we can now design reusable rockets. But when we hit the inflection point in 2015 of the first time SpaceX landed a rocket, that was when it was like the first time an airplane flew across the United States and now could refuel and come back. So ticket prices dropped. You could now count on the cadence of flights. And therefore a bunch of new businesses like Varda that everyone knew was coming from an engineering perspective. It's just the math didn't work out yet. Like microgravity on drugs has been around for decades as an experiment on the International Space Station. But so everyone knew this was coming and was just waiting for the unit economics to work out.
Can you talk a little bit about drug development in space and the role that Varda is playing and how you think about Varda? Because I've heard you describe Varda as a pharmaceuticals company. Like you make drugs, but you're also building capsules that have rockets on them that have to stay in orbit. And this is exceptionally demanding stuff. Do you imagine that you're kind of a space company, but also a pharmaceuticals company? Are you a pharmaceuticals company that is a space company? What does it mean?
Yeah, it's kind of this weird, unique beast because we're bringing 2 very different industries together. It is, I always kid around, it's space drugs. So there is the space first. We have to build the thing. It is very similar, I think, to the refrigeration analogy in the sense that when refrigerators were first invented, you could now use them to make things cold during the manufacturing process and therefore make drug formulations that you otherwise couldn't make because you can now make things cold, right? And if you want to use it, if for the non-chemists in the room, drug development and formulation is very similar to recipes and cooking. I mean, cooking is chemistry. And so if you think about a shelf, you can use that to make PB&J and sandwiches and that sort of thing. But if you then introduce a temperature knob to the shelf, you have an oven and it opens up this whole new world of recipes that you can make with the same ingredients. Same food, just now gone through a temperature cycle. Same story, but for drugs, where we're now introducing a gravity knob that also allows you to manipulate the chemistry in a way that you couldn't. So if you think about it in this analogy, we are making this anti-gravity machine. Like when you think about our pharmaceutical customers, they actually don't care that we're going to space. We think it's awesome and it's altruistic and, cave paintings and like, don't get me wrong, I subscribe to that as much as the next person. But at the end of the day, they're like, great, but like, where's the drugs? We want them to be via a shot.
The drugs? I hear
right?
that all the time.
Exactly. Yeah. But hey, we're stuck on this drug. It's administered via an IV bag. We show the research on the International Space Station shows that, they took the actual drug and if crystallized in microgravity, you can now change it from an IV bag to a shot. That is what the pharma companies care about. And so they don't actually care that we're going to space. They would much rather us just have an anti-gravity machine in the back of the lab. Obviously, that's impossible on Earth. That's Einstein's principle of equivalence. You have to go to space and be in free fall in order to have microgravity manipulate the chemistry. And so in this analogy, all the spacecraft we're building, the rockets, everything, like pay no attention to that stuff behind the curtain. We are just offering an anti-gravity oven to the pharmaceutical industry. And as shipping to space becomes just shipping with reusable rockets, to them, instead of FedEx, it's SpaceX, but everything else looks very similar to them because they'll ship drugs in situ of development and in situ of manufacturing to various places like synthesis here, but dosing in Ireland, packaging in North Carolina. So shipping somewhere to do a single unit batch operation is not different for the pharmaceutical industry. We kind of convince them that space is no different as well, but once we establish that precedent, then everything else just falls into place.
Okay, and I promise I'm going to get to the launches, but
Please,
because we started talking about culture already,
I
want to talk about the kind of person who comes to work at Varda and what happens on day one. Like, are there particular books that kind of everyone has read? Are there particular films that everyone has seen? What kind of conversations are taking place? And what sort of disciplines are you hiring for there? I know you've got your engineers. Do you also have people who are chemists who are doing that sort of work in-house?
We do. We have pharmaceutical scientists and formulation developers that have been at top 20 pharma companies that have developed drugs and brought them to market before, and they sit right alongside, a thermal engineer working on a heat shield of a spacecraft, or a structures engineer designing, or a propulsion engineer designing the rocket, for example. And what's really great is we have this kind of secret sauce at Varda, or this special aspect, I should say, in the sense that everyone who's in the aerospace industry knows that the ticket off this planet is no longer a technical hurdle. We've been to the moon 70 years ago, right? So what's the big way to get more human activity in the cosmos is a business problem. Like, how do we generate value there to warrant further growth? And so aerospace engineers, especially the good ones, are brutally aware of this problem. And so the reason they want to work at Varda is like, oh, that's a business model that makes sense and perpetuates a demand for more vehicles in orbit. And the more demand there is for rockets, the lower the prices, the more regular the cadence, and really driving to make shipping to space just shipping. And so the aerospace engineers look at the formulation scientists as their ticket off of this planet, of their aspirations of building flight hardware, myself included, is like, I started the drug company because it makes sense in space. It wasn't for the drugs per se. But the other aspect of it is the pharmaceutical scientists, they could be working at any company. But if you're going to go to Pfizer, or you're going to go to GSK, or you're going to go to Varda, where it's the same thing except in space, right? So it's just strictly cooler. Right, so the pharmaceutical scientists are like, "Oh, you're going to send my drugs to space? It's just fucking nuts, man!" Whereas the aerospace engineers have the same reciprocal pull. So you have this this gravitational pull of at Varda that's really like the centerpiece of the culture there.
And I'd asked about culture, and part of the reason I asked is because I've worked alongside VCs. I've talked to a number of people who are in different startup spaces and who work at SpaceX. And I'm not surprised anymore, but I suspect a lot of people would be surprised to discover that cool factor you were describing, just a genuine interest and passion about space and all things related to space, is part of what motivates these people. Jeff, Elon, I only use their first names and everyone knows who I'm talking about, have these tremendous fortunes and could do just about anything with their time. And they're working on one of the hardest problems imaginable, like trying to get the species off planet and onto other worlds. I wonder, and I asked about kind of culture and the books and the movies, because my sense is that at pretty much all of these companies, there is a sort of lexicon there. And there is a kind of catalog of things that we watch and we read that sort of show up in every place. I know at Founders Fund, Tolkien is pretty important. Varda, borrowed from Tolkien's work. Is there anything like that is kind of a linchpin for you all from a cultural standpoint?
The closest thing I would say is Apollo 13 is if there's a video, or if there's a movie or a film that...
it kind of ended well, but they had a bit of challenges.
Oh, and it was a blast along the way. So our first mission was way more stressful than that. That made Apollo 13 look like a road trip coming of age story compared to mission 1 for us.
Okay. We're going to come to that next.
Yeah, by the sweet grace of the launch gods, that thing came down. But it was an 8-month Apollo 13 basically. But no, I would say that's at the centerpiece of the lexicon. There's a few reasons why people like space. I think quick show of hands. Raise your hand if it's the altruistic aspect of like moving humanity further and further. All right, cool. Oh, okay, more than I was expecting. What about the feeling that it makes us feel bigger than ourselves? Right, like we're on this little pale blue dot. All right. Any don't want the human experience or the consciousness to disappear, and therefore we need fault tolerance with Mars. Oh, all right. Wow. Okay. And some of the hands were like multiple reasons, right? So I subscribe to most of those. If I had to pick one, it's just because it's fucking awesome. It's rockets are like flying buildings that are going off the planet. When our capsule comes back in, it's ripping through the atmosphere faster than any other vehicle imaginable. It's going 17,000 miles an hour. So that's 25 times the speed of sound. So 25 times the speed of your commercial airliner. It's going so fast that it's ripping apart the atmosphere on the way in. And on board, we're going to like help some guy, or gal with some drugs on board. Like, I can't imagine anything cooler than that. And so I think the folks who join Varda see the excitement and the fun in the fact that it is just awesome. And in the process, we're checking off all these really cool boxes of like helping mankind and, moving off our planet and all this sort of thing. Because if for all the reasons that we all kind of subscribe to, you need to have a regular shipping to space is just shipping situation, and we think we're building that foundation. So we're kind of like having a lot of fun doing it, and at the same time enabling all these altruistic things while we're having a blast.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about launch. We've mentioned SpaceX and Rocket Labs, and I think that's the part that most people are familiar with. Like, we're all aware that there has just been this explosion in terms of the volume of payload that's being taken up to space at any point in time. But I think what people don't appreciate is just how few people are actually involved in this business of kind of bringing things back from orbit. And it's one thing for things to kind of crash through the atmosphere and that's it. Yeah. It's another thing to bring it down in a controlled way and have to land it. And Varda has been at the forefront of a number of things. But as I understand it, you guys are also achieving a bunch of firsts. And in some cases, maybe not first, but like third. But Varda is only the third company to...
That's right. It's the third commercial entity to ever bring something back from orbit, which is a clarification that means a lot, because if you're not in the aerospace industry, if you think going to space and going to orbit, they're completely different things. So
tell me how.
Yeah. So going to space, you can go to space with nothing but a natty light cannon, a hot air balloon, and a GoPro. And if you Google those 3 words or YouTube those 3 words, you will see a natty light can with a GoPro go to space on a balloon.
Yeah.
Easy to do. And that's kind of what Blue Origin's doing. It's, I kind of think of it as a roller coaster for rich people, at least, and it goes up and it comes right back down.
Yeah.
Now they're building New Glenn, which is legit and awesome.
Yeah, they have broader ambitions.
Right,
sure.
Right. But in the near term, it's just up and down, which is a much easier engineering problem than going into orbit, which is all about velocity. So the way to think about orbit is if you're running like off of a cliff, obviously the faster you run and jump, you'll land farther and farther out. So if you run farther or faster and you jump off the cliff, you'll land farther out, run even faster, even farther out. Now, if you take that thought experiment to the extreme, and you run so fast that you go so far that you actually, the Earth starts curving out from under you before you hit it. That's what orbit is. So you're falling, but you're moving so fast horizontally that the Earth is curving out from under you and you just keep falling essentially. And that's why you feel weightlessness when you're in orbit. And that engineering challenge is immense because you have to figure out not just how to get high, but also how to get fast. And that fast part is the hardest part, not just for, and then it's hard for going up, but it's even harder for coming back down because you got to put all that energy somewhere. And so that's where the heat shield technology comes in, and that's where the spacecraft aerodynamics come in to be able to bring something from orbit back to Earth is a significantly difficult engineering challenge, and that's why the Varda is only the third company ever to do it.
Now, we've gone through kind of launch. We've just talked about orbit here. You're doing most of the heavy lifting for your factories in orbit. Can you describe the craft that you all have created, the capsule itself? Talk about a little bit about the work that's being done by the capsule while it's in orbit, and perhaps give folks a sense of like what the kind of future of these capsules might look like.
Yeah, so the first family is super primitive, and we try to keep it as simple as possible just to get the proof of concept going. So it will be the cave paintings of the future factories of tomorrow. But what we've done is it's a capsule. It's the bare minimum to be able to get to space and back. All right, so from a forget about the drugs for a second, just from putting something in orbit and then getting a thing and bringing it back to Earth, it's the simplest design possible. It's basically just a heat shield, and it looks like a very small version of the Apollo capsule, if you've seen Apollo 13. Inside it, now where gravity plays a role in the chemistry is during crystallization. So most of the drugs people take are actually in crystal form. It just means it's a solid. So like pills, for example, are drugs in a crystal form. And where gravity plays a role is in the crystallization process, when a molecule goes from in solution, wiggling about individually, and then collapses into a crystal structure. So if you've ever made like rock candy as a kid, where you take sugar water and you stick the stick into the water, and slowly these crystals grow, that's the exact chemistry that's happening, except instead of sugar molecules, it's drug molecules. And when that crystallization occurs in microgravity, they lock in a different shape, and that's what enables new formulations. And so all we're doing up there is ice is a crystal lattice. So all we're doing up there is taking molecules from being individuals in a solution, like an IV bag, and then crystallizing them. And we can do that via temperature, like cooling it, like freezing it. Or we can do that chemically by adding a third-party chemical that saturates the fluid and causes these crystals to grow, like in the rock candy example. And then so that process, very simple, right? So what did I just say? We're mixing fluids. We're changing the temperature of fluids. So the quote robot, or the drug processing unit in our capsule, we're not doing the final product of the drugs. We're just doing the crystallization. You still need to dose it. You still need to post-process it. You still need to package it on Earth. We're not making pills up there. We're only doing the active ingredients. And so when those crystals then form, the hardware that's doing it are literally just heaters and mixers. So it looks like an espresso machine. And that's basically it.
So this espresso machine,
tubes, pumps, heaters, fluids, valves, filters.
Who are your customers? Are the pharmaceutical companies coming to look for you? Do you have to kind of court them? Do they understand why microgravity matters? You mentioned earlier that they don't really care that you're going to space. Is there a way to do the sort of work that you're doing in space here on the ground cheaply?
The first part of your question, so I guess I'll answer the second part first. You cannot manipulate gravity on Earth. You cannot reduce it. You can increase it with a centrifuge. So when you accelerate your car real fast, or you take a sharp turn, and that force you feel is equivalent to gravity. But you can't reduce it on Earth. Otherwise, airplanes wouldn't have wings. We'd float around. It'd be great. Luckily, we will never have a terrestrial competitor. Or Einstein's wrong. Win-win, right? Like either new physics or Varda has a monopoly. I'm happy with either in this case.
Okay.
But what was the first part of your question?
I don't know.
Oh.
I was asking you how your customers find it.
Customers, that's right.
Yeah.
Right. The pharma customers are the ones who did the research on the ISS decades ago. So they, quite frankly, came up with this idea. So I'll give you a hallmark drug is Keytruda, which is Merck's highest revenue drug.
Okay. Very
famous chemotherapy. It's for when you have cancer. Jimmy Carter took it, right? And they flew it on the International Space Station even before Varda started, just to show that when it crystallizes in microgravity, you can change the formulation from an IV bag to a shot. And so when we call up Merck and we say, hey, we're making drugs in space, they're like, yeah, you're copying our idea or commercializing it. They're very thankful, right? They did it in a research capacity on the ISS, but and the ISS is the International Space Station. There's about 6 people in it at any given time, and they're doing science experiments. But you can't commercialize, you can't manufacture in a national lab, right? So if you think about this terrestrially, national labs will develop technology all the time. And then you'll have businesses go and commercialize it and build an actual manufacturing facility. But they'll never manufacture it in the original lab, right? The lab is for research purposes. And that's what the International Space Station is. We're the commercialization of it. So when we go to Merck or BMS or these other companies who have flown drugs on the International Space Station to show microgravity's impacts, they already get it. It's not, they're like, yeah, of course, like we thought of this idea.
Okay. So but the short answer to companies coming to find you, they have a sense that they need this kind of particular compound produced. And do you have clients at this point? You've had, I guess, 3 missions that you've flown. One is up there right now and is going to be coming down at some point pretty soon.
So we have 3 up. We've launched 2 drugs so far. So every drug is very specific. And so all the pharma companies get the science of it, and they're like, okay, we understand microgravity.
Yeah.
How are we going to use microgravity on this specific drug and improve it with this specific formulation? And that's where the real science is, because very similar, going back to the temperature example, if they already understand how an oven can manipulate the food, we get it, right? It makes things hotter. We kind of understand it makes the molecules vibrate faster, and typically things burn or they melt or that sort of thing. And they're like, okay, but we got this random ingredients, cheese or whatever, right? Does it melt? Does it caramelize like sugar? We don't know yet. We got to figure that out, right? So every ingredient going into the oven has a different response to when the temperature goes up. Similar story in microgravity. So the conversations with our pharma customers are like, hey, let's do the research now to figure out what, we have this specific drug problem, and we want to formulate it in this way. How can microgravity help us with this specific formulation challenge? And so the majority of our pharma interactions right now are the research to figure out exactly what that molecule is doing in microgravity so that we can create a product that actually goes into a human after the fact. Now, we also at Varda we have pretty good intuition of how microgravity affects the chemical systems in the same way that, if you're playing with an oven all day, you kind of get an idea of how the food reacts when it goes into the oven. And so we also pick the drugs we want to work on from first principles even before going to the customers, because it's a little bit of more lucrative business model if you develop the formulation first and then you go to your customer and be like, hey, I solved this problem. Look how lucrative it is.
Sure.
It's a better negotiation situation than like, hey, let us help you solve your problems and we'll start from square one.
Okay. I'm curious about where you are on your roadmap and what you see as kind of the biggest opportunities and challenges going forward. I'm also curious about manufacturing things beyond pharmaceuticals. I know you guys have looked at fiber optics and there's some other things on the horizon. Do you have a sense about the thing that you would most want to produce in space?
I think drugs are the most. I got very lucky. Like I picked drugs because it makes the most sense from a business perspective, but if it's also getting to help people back on Earth, and so I feel a little bit, phony saying that, we're helping people back on Earth, because everyone knows I got into this business for the spacecraft. Like I said, it's just awesome, right?
Yeah.
But luckily, the business model also points to the fact that the way to make this the most successful is to create a product that actually genuinely improves people's lives on Earth. So, my mom's very happy about that. That's why drugs. Now, if you think about stack ranking, what makes the most sense to manufacture in microgravity, just because drugs are so expensive and because microgravity has such a significant impact on that chemistry, the first 300 things are drugs. So that's why Varda is a microgravity-enabled life sciences company, because we'll be in the drug business for a decade before we start thinking about other products. But that being said, gravity is a fundamental force of physics. So being able to manipulate it means that, any manufacturing prospect is suspect as long as you're willing to pay the shipping cost of going to space and back. So a lot of this research has already been done on the International Space Station for someday when it makes sense to commercialize it. So drugs are the most common experiment on the International Space Station for that reason. But there's silicon wafers, fiber optics, anything where crystallization is part of the manufacturing process is where gravity has the biggest lever arm to make a positive impact.
And you're just, with respect to, like, say, silicon wafers, is it just a matter of the payload is so heavy and so demanding, or is the process itself of actually building the chips and stuff that's too daunting at this stage?
So if you think about what a silicon wafer really is, it's a sand crystal, if you will, and then they etch into that crystal the transistors and the other parts of the microprocessor.
Sure.
The more pure you can make that crystal, the more efficient you can make the computing on that chip. And so if you grow a crystal in microgravity, apples to apples compared to growing a crystal on Earth, or formulated crystal on Earth, microgravity will create a more pure crystal. And so you can make strictly better semiconductors in microgravity than you could otherwise on Earth. Now, the unit economics, the business model demands shipping to space and back to be less expensive than it is now for the unit economics to work, and that's why we're working on drugs first.
Sure.
But that's a killer app. Like if it cost only $10 to go to space and back, then all of our computer chips would be made in space. How
was your experience different at SpaceX than the experience you're having at Varda, apart from being in charge and working on very different things? Is there kind of a substantial cultural difference? Are there things that you learned there that you took there, that you've taken over to Varda because it was so important to SpaceX? Are the things that you experienced there that you definitely didn't want to do again, that you're kind of keeping away?
Well, there's definitely
not
more.
to get you to badmouth your former
No.
employer.
I loved it there.
I
so,
suspect they're
and I'm not just saying that because they're my only shipping provider. I did love it there. Some of my best memories are from working at SpaceX. The only reason I left was because I was curious about what else was going on in the world. And I felt like the next big milestone for us was Mars, and I felt like that was at least 15 years out, and so I might as well check some other things out first and try some other stuff. Varda is very similar to SpaceX in a lot of ways. We have the concept of the RE, the responsible engineer, this concept of ultimate ownership, entrepreneurialism at the individual contributor level. And what I mean by that is we basically throw a deliverable, and by deliverable I mean like a flight computer or a solar array or a heat shield, to an engineer and say like, hey, this has to work. I don't know how it's going to work. You don't really have a safety net. If it works, you get promoted. If not, you get fired. But it's up to you. And that's went back to ask of like what kind of people want to work at Varda. It's like, if you found that statement attractive and like exciting and like, yeah, I want to bet on myself, that's the type of people we look for and that get in the door at Varda. One of the reasons I think Varda has been able to hire well is because we have a good sense of like the engineering zeitgeist. And I think the pendulum is moving away from the glorified leader of the Jeffs, the Elons, the Richard Bransons. And so what I've tried to build at Varda is a leadership, right? Like I want people to come to Varda because the leadership is awesome, right? It's like, this is the best team that exists. Like where the most elite engineers go. And so, I tweet less. That's step one. And step two is really emphasizing that, right? Like I make sure the engineers at Varda know that we're not just building a spacecraft, we're also building a company. And the company you build is the team you build. So like at the end of the day, if the spacecraft works, but the team fails, we're eventually doomed. But if the team works and the spacecraft fails, we get a second chance.
Sure.
And so I definitely emphasize the team and the camaraderie a lot more. And I mean, that was my favorite part of old school SpaceX. And so even that I kind of took a little bit, but yeah.
So I think we're getting towards the end here. I want to ask one last question. So the last thing isn't about someone not doing so well. What is a thing in your industry broadly? It could be at Varda, it could be beyond, that you are particularly excited about?
I mean, I'm pretty excited about Varda.
I'm sure.
Let's see, Varda and beyond. What is the thing I'm most excited about? Okay, I'll tell you what I'm most excited about. I'm most excited about, if you look at the launch industry, only in 2015, right before the first reusable rocket launched, the number of rockets was equivalent to the number of was equal to the number of daily flights out of Napa, California. Okay. Today, the number of rocket launches per year is equal to the number of flights out of LAX.
Wow.
All right. So, since 2015, 10 years. And if you think about the airport as being representative to the size of the city, and therefore launch being representative to the size of the aerospace industry, that means the aerospace industry went from Napa to LA in the last 10 years. That's bananas. All right. And the reason I'm so excited right now, especially about Varda, is because right now, all of the things that are being launched are either Earth observation or telecommunication, which means if you think of it from a business model, these are satellites that are capital investments. You put them up and then you leave them up there, right? DirecTV, Sirius Satellite Radio, they have no need to come down. And once the constellation is populated, you saturate your demand for launch. But what's really cool about Varda and any other company that's not doing that is doing something with a consumable product, right? We're consuming drugs, which means our constellation never populates. We have a perpetual demand for launch. And so we've hit this, inflection point where we now are driving global launch demand to go from Napa Valley to LAX to something even crazier, because that is really the unlock that makes rockets look like airplanes from a cadence perspective. And then once they are taken off as much as airplanes, then shipping to space is truly shipping. And then that, I think, is step one. That's like Varda's near-term mission in the next 5 to 10 years. After that, if you can get to space that cheaply and that reliably, then space stations are literally just apartments essentially at that point, right? Like I said earlier, if you can reduce the launch price to only $10 a pound, then it's literally the same thing as FedEx. And then you can build a station where you can do more mass manufacturing, do the things you mentioned like silicon wafers, fiber optics, stuff like that. And I think where the holy grail, I guess, of this whole thing, of everything we're talking about, is when you put someone into one of those space stations, a working class individual, they do some job like on an oil rig and they return, and that whole process generated more value than it cost for them to go there and back. And so it was a net positive experience. And when that happens, then the free hand of the market really lifts us off the planet.
That's amazing. Yeah. Cool. Awesome. Thank you.